Hello, I am Angel Eugenio Tovar, and this is a video abstract for my poster entitled A Computational Approach to Perception and Language in Autism Based on Self-Organizing Maps. This poster was presented at the virtual meeting of the Cognitive Science Society in 2020.
One important challenge in the study of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is to understand how the different cognitive and behavioral symptoms are interrelated, and whether they could be a consequence of common underlying atypical cognitive or neuronal mechanisms. In this study, we want to take a step forward by analyzing the relationship between atypical perception and language in ASD. Particularly, we focused on the relationship between visual categorization and lexical development. We used self-organizing maps to do this. So let's go first through the basics of self-organizing maps, also called SOMs. SOMs are neural networks that have been used to study categorization. This is a graphic representation of what a SOM looks like. Each white circle represents an artificial neuron. The basic idea is to present several objects to the SOM, one at a time, like this cap here, and after several stimulation events, the artificial neurons in the SOM start to form local assemblies that become specialized in responding to categories of objects. For example, this gray area here has become specialized in processing caps, with a neuron in black known as the best matching unit, or BMU. This unit stores the best representation of this category, what we could also call the prototypic internal representation of caps. The local assemblies in the SOM are formed through continuous learning that involves competition and cooperation between neurons. Competition and cooperation allow for the establishment of the gray area, also called the neighborhood. How did we model autism? We did it through modifications in the neighborhood function. If you are interested in the mathematical details of this modification, you can see our publication in Developmental Science, where we explain these details. The basic idea is that the neighborhood should look something like this gray area. However, with the modification in the neighborhood function, we created something that looks like this. These yellow points show the extension of the neighborhood in the autism simulation. Of course, this is a graphical representation, but what this represents is that these neighborhoods are larger in the simulations of autism, and this creates problem when we want to separate the different categories of objects that have been presented to the SOM. This modification was inspired by reports of hyperplasticity and hyperconnectivity in ASD. The final architecture of our model also included a word label layer. This is a simple layer of units with symbolic representations where each unit represents a word label. So for example, activation of this unit represents the presentation of the word cap. During the second stage of training in our simulations, we present both visual and word label inputs to our model. The word label layer and the visual SOM were connected through Hebbian connections. The basic methodology that we follow was this. In the first stage, we presented objects to the visual SOM. We presented a total of 89 objects belonging to 30 categories. Each object was vectorized, and vectors included information of color and shape of objects. During the second stage, we presented both visual objects and word labels to our model. Finally, we analyzed the categories in the typical SOM and in the SOM with the modification of the neighborhood function simulating ASD. We were interested in analyzing the organization of categories in the SOMs and the prototype representations stored in these SOMs. What we found in our analysis of categorization is that the typical model, the typical SOM, did categorize objects. So for example, different apples were processed by the same units in the SOM. This showed organization of categories. However, in the model of ASD, the SOM did not show organization of categories. Objects were processed in different units of the SOM regardless of category membership. This has been referred in the literature as fragmented representations of categories. This is what we did for the prototype analysis. Each object was presented to the sum through 7-dimension vectors. In this plot, we show the normalized value of each of these dimensions across the 5 different exemplars of objects in category 1. We determine the mean value of these exemplars, and we call this the mean prototype of category 1, and the prototype values are shown here in the blue figure of this plot. So this is the graphic representation of the prototypic object in category 1. We analyzed how similar this prototype was to the prototype learned by the typical model, or the model with the typical parameters. Here I show that there is a high correlation between the blue prototype, which is a mean prototype from category 1, and the orange prototype, which is the prototype learned and stored in the BMU of the typical sum. And this other figure shows the prototype stored in the BMU of the model with the ASD parameters. As you can see, it does not resemble the prototype obtained through the mean values of exemplars in category 1. This analysis captures what has been reported in empirical studies of prototype formation with people with ASD. Our study provides a mechanistic account for the atypical categorization and prototype formation processes in ASD. These processes may account as well for delays in lexical development. Well-organized categories help to extend word labels to the members of the category. However, unorganized categories make it difficult to extend these labels. Instead, it seems that under this constraint, there must be one-to-one mappings between objects and word labels instead of category to word label mappings. We argue that behavioral interventions promoting category formation could help in increasing vocabulary development. That's it. Please feel free to ask any questions or send me an email with your comments.